It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman here with Cindy Black for Theology about a Thursday. Thanks for being here, Cindy.
Good morning.
I feel like there's been people talking about this recently. Back on August 5th, the Pew Research Center released some information about a study that they did that 7 in 10 U.S. Catholics believe bread, wine used in communion are symbolic. That's what it says. So they said 69% of people that they surveyed, which I think it's safe to assume that they, had a variety of people, but 69% of them said that they think that the Eucharist, communion, the bread and wine are just symbolically Jesus, not what the church teaches, which is that it's truly the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus present in the Eucharist, that there's a change that happens, the transubstantiation that happens during the Eucharistic prayer. And so I haven't really dug into this enough to know, I'm kind of curious, do they know church teaching and just disagree with it? Or were they not even aware that the church teaches that it's changed?
From other radio programs who have discussed this, they've kind of said it's a both and.
Sure.
And that there's been a lot of discussion about, well, if you're self-identified Catholic, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to Mass or understand the teachings. But it is a sobering statistic, no matter whether they know they've heard it and don't believe, or whether they have never really come to understand that. So I think it's important for us to spend time reflecting on the real presence of Jesus and how we've come to know that it truly is Him, His real presence, and what we can kind of do, given the statistic, to help the physical reality that in our faith, we actually have God dwelling among us continually, and He desires intimacy so much that He actually comes into our bodies. So again, we have this meeting of the spiritual and the bodily, the physical. So I think it's worth delving into that. I was thinking about how do we know that Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity is contained in what looks like bread and what looks and tastes like wine. This sounds like a flippant answer, but because Jesus said so, but not in the way that, a parent would say, because I said so, you have to obey, and it's not a blind faith where just because Jesus said so, we can't engage our reason. It's really Jesus because He said so, and He is God, and what He says becomes so.
Right.
When Jesus spoke these words at the Last Supper, He spoke them to His disciples who had been with Him, following Him, had seen Him calm the storm by commanding it to calm.
Yeah.
That Jesus as God has dominion over all of creation. That nothing in creation came into existence without His will, and it can't remain in existence without His will. So the only part of creation that has free will to go against our nature is the human person. So when Jesus said to the storm, or when He multiplied the loaves and fish, when He transformed the water to wine at the wedding feast of Cana, He did that by willing it.
Yeah.
So the disciples had experienced all of this. So at the Last Supper, which was the Passover meal, Jesus explained that He would be the new Passover, the new covenant. And when He took the bread in His hands and said, "This is my body," the disciples took that as this is my body, because they had seen Jesus say those things. They had heard the bread of life discourse. So even though they really probably didn't understand it, because they still weren't clear that Calvary was the next day.
Yeah.
Jesus had shared that with them, but they didn't have a full understanding, but they really believed that. And they knew that words could change reality, and that Jesus' words could change creation.
Yeah. Because Jesus is truth. So anything that he says is true. So if he says you are healed, then you're healed. If he says you're forgiven, then you're forgiven. If he says this is my body, then it's his body.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And he was clear when he spoke metaphorically or told parables. He was very clear in that. And also, it's not a blind faith, because the disciples who, after Jesus, went on, when he said, "Do this in memory of me," they continued to celebrate the Eucharist from the early days.
Yep.
And it was in the context of the Christian community celebrating the Eucharist as Jesus had commanded that the scriptures flowed out, the New Testament scriptures flowed from. So the Mass and the real presence was being celebrated at the time where the New Testament was being drawn, where it was, where this was being written about. So it was put into practice before it was written down.
Yeah. Dr. Scott Hahn says that the New Testament was a sacrament before it was a document, according to the document.
There you go. Right.
We had the Eucharist before we had the New Testament written down in the form of a document. First, we have the church.
Right.
And we have the sacrament of the Eucharist.
Yeah. And so if we think about how when Jesus says to the bread and wine, it can't disobey and say, "No, I'm not going to change."
Right.
So by his words, it becomes that. And if we look back on the Old Testament, the Passover celebration, or the enactment of the Passover, required that the Jewish people who had been spared would actually consume the lamb. So Jesus becomes the Paschal Lamb, and we consume him in the new covenant. And as we consume him, because we're limited and finite and he is infinite, we don't consume him so much as he consumes us. Like as we consume him, we're transformed. He cannot be limited to our physical being, but he elevates us to his eternal being, which is the whole mystery of the incarnation. That God descends and takes on human flesh so that our flesh can be elevated and become eternal eventually.
Right.
And share in that divine nature.
What is the line that the priest says? It says, "Shared in our humanity so that we may share in his divinity?" Or
by the mingling of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity.
There it is.
There we go. Yeah. So we have this incredible gift of the real presence. Jesus is present in the tabernacle throughout the world. And we have to make sure that that is where our faith flows from. The Catechism in paragraph 1327 says, "The Eucharist is the sum and summary of our faith. Our way of thinking is attuned to the Eucharist, and the Eucharist in turn confirms our way of thinking." That if we are truly going to be disciples of Jesus Christ, we have to live that Eucharistic mystery, receiving him as often as we can, and then also spending time with him in his real presence, so that then we can go share him with the world, literally carry him out as living tabernacles and share his love with all the people that we encounter, starting with our family, making sure that we all have a sense of the real presence and the gift that the Eucharist is, and then share that joy, that gift, be willing to share that with other people.
Yeah. And I personally don't have a hard time. It just makes sense to me that Jesus said this, and he repeats it over and over and over again. It wasn't just like he said it one time, but he's like, this is my body. This is my, unless you eat my flesh. Like, just repeat over and over and over. And so to me, it's been fairly easy to accept as the truth. But if someone is struggling with this, so were the early disciples.
Right.
That many of them left and said, this teaching is too hard. Who could accept this? And so they left. And so Jesus asks the apostles, are you going to leave too? And they don't say, no, we're on board. This makes sense to us. This is easy. They said, well, where else would we go? What other option do we have but to trust you and to believe you and to stay with you? Like, you are the Messiah. So no, we'll stick around. Like, I kind of imagine that they were kind of struggling with that teaching as well. Like you said, not having witnessed the death and resurrection and not having kind of the foresight that we can look back at today and have this history of, breaking it down with theologians and all of this. But the teaching is hard, and it's understandable that people are struggling with this, but to not just say like, yeah, I don't buy it, but to really dig in deep. I really think that if people do the research, look in, read John chapter 6, you're going to be able to understand the teaching and then just trust as well. And
reading the early church fathers, that there are writings that existed before the New Testament canon did that refer to this real presence and the Eucharisted bread. And how
St. Justin Martyr wrote on it real early on.
But also it's reflected in St. Irenaeus, Augustine. Origen. There was this sense of the real presence and this understanding of that mystery that continued from the very first apostles. And, it's been unbroken since then, that Jesus has existed within the Eucharist. And, it's when you really stop to think about it, it really is awe-inspiring, and that it's such a gift to us to be able to receive Jesus in that way. And the fact that it retains the accidental flavor, I think, is also a gift to us. But if you're doubting, I would also suggest Google Eucharistic miracles. It's really amazing how the host, like several priests have dropped a host and then placed it to dissolve in the water or in the precious blood or something. And they've come back and it's basically red and has turned into heart muscle, or flesh. And when you start reading these things, really, you can't make this stuff up.
There's all kinds of websites that have these stories on them. There's books on it too. So, all right, thank you for this. And really, if you're struggling with this, dive in, look into it, read about Eucharistic miracles.
And spend time with him before the Blessed Sacrament.
All right, thank you so much, Cindy. Appreciate it.